In just a matter of days, the Al-Qaeda splinter group known as ISIS has seized major cities in Iraq and claimed to have killed hundreds of Shiite Iraqi security forces in their wake. Now the militants sit on the doorstep of the capital city, Baghdad. Joining us now for more on the conflict in Vancouver, British Columbia, Janice Stein, TVO's foreign affairs analyst and the director of the Munk School of Global Affairs. And with us here in studio, happy to welcome back Eric Margolis, syndicated columnist and author, and Thabit Abdullah, professor of history at York University and the author of A Short History of Iraq. Let us start, as I welcome two faces we haven't seen in a long time here. Welcome back to you. And Janice, thanks for joining us from the left coast. Let's put up a couple of maps just to remind everybody the part of the world that we're talking about. Everybody knows Iraq now. You've seen this on your TVs a lot lately. Here is the country of Iraq in desperate trouble, as you've no doubt heard on the news over the past several days. And then let's flip this over and show the areas where the conflict is particularly intense as we zoom in on that. And then we'll get into some discussion about why and where all this is taking place. Those explosion signs, as you can see, are moving ever closer to Baghdad. Eric, just I guess a housekeeping point before we start here. I have heard ISIS referred to as the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. I've also heard it referred to as the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. Which is right?
Well, they're both right. We have a lot of trouble translating names from Arabic and Persian, but I personally, in my columns, use the ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Al-Shams, which is the Arab name for the territory of Greater Syria.
Okay. And Janice, to you on the next point, how are they different from Al-Qaeda?
They're a branch of Al-Qaeda which split after Al-Qaeda denounced ISIS for what Al-Qaeda says its militancy and its violence against civilians. They were fighting essentially together in Syria against the al-Assad regime, and so that split occurred in the midst of the fight in Syria.
Thabit, let me follow up on that. To what extent do you think Syria's civil war has contributed to the growth of ISIS?
Well, fundamentally. There was always a risk, of course, of more and more extremism as the power vacuum was not really getting filled, especially in the areas north of Baghdad. But with the civil war in Syria, there was now a large power vacuum in the northeastern part especially, and northern part of Syria, from Aleppo all the way to the border with Iraq. And this allowed, of course, all kinds of disaffected elements to organize, regroup, and then cross the border.
Let me pull a bit of an audible on the control room here. If we can bring up that second map one more time where the conflict areas are highlighted. Eric, I'd like you, if you can, to speak to what's happening on the ground in Iraq right now that gives you the most concern. And here we've seen the highlighted areas in the north in Mosul and just outside Baghdad where recent attacks have taken place. What gives you the most concern about what's happening in Iraq right now?
Well, you know, as an observer of modern Middle East history, I'm taken by the fact that we've seen so many uprisings coming out of nowhere, Islamic uprisings against the Western imposed order. And I'm going all the way back to Sudan in the late 1880s with the dervishes and the Mahdis and Gordon of Khartoum and all of that. And here we have another thing, hysteria in the West as this army of sword-waving Muslims advances on Baghdad. Well, I don't think they're going to get there. This is an armed mob, really, rather than a coherent military force. They're a bunch of guys in pickup trucks of some local effective fighting value, but on a higher level, they don't. They're going to be attacked shortly by U.S. air power, if that's not happening already. And they are effective in their own area, but I don't know how they're going to be hold on predominantly Shia areas.
John Kerry described them as an existential threat to what's going on over there. You don't see it that way?
No, it's a hysterical response. Existential threat to the U.S.-installed puppet government in Baghdad, maybe, but I don't think that ISIS or IS can actually seize the capital. It's a very large city, and hold it.
Janice, one of the things I think people are trying to figure out is they just had an election there in which Maliki won re-election. That was just 3 weeks ago. Things were supposed to be sort of settling down. What has in fact ratcheted things up?
Well, Steve, Maliki did win re-election, but he won re-election with the support of the large Shia in Baghdad, community in Baghdad and the south. In fact, he's been increasingly alienated from the Sunni area. This is a leader with no vision. He practiced exclusivist politics, frankly went after the Sunni, left them no room in a coalition government, exiled one of their leaders to Kurdistan. So this is an all-or-nothing politician, and even now, when his regime seems to be threatened, he's summoning Shia from all over the country to fight, but making no overtures to Sunni leaders. You know, what's interesting in this story to me is not ISIS, because they've been able to move back and forth across the border from Syria, but the former Ba'athist tribes and Saddam supporters who have joined the fight, and they're doing this largely to get rid of the Maliki government from the Sunni areas. So it is local.
But this is why this group is more than just a flash in the pan. You know, to a certain extent, you know, I understand what's being said, but there is an existentialist threat here, because despite the fact that these extremist elements are abhorred even in Sunni territories, but they have the ability to intensify and deepen sectarianism. This, coupled with Maliki's dogged refusal to truly establish a government of national reconciliation, a national unity government, in which basically he would have to accept some sort of compromise with the various elements that are vying for power, and perhaps even accept the presence of some rather, you know, unpalatable individuals. But he has refused this, and coupled then with the violence of this extremist group, the sectarian divide could deepen, and I fear very much for the country. I mean, I've appeared on this program many times in the past, and I've always had an optimistic, you know, view in the long run.
Not now?
But well, now it's really, you know, on a knife's edge. I mean, no country, no matter how incredibly united it is, this applies even to Canada and any other country. No country has a divine right to be unified forever. Countries are man-made, and groups like this could eventually lead to some kind of a division.
Let me get Eric's take on that. Do you think Maliki's unwillingness to genuinely share power in a way that has satisfied all of the constituent groups in Iraq is responsible for where the country is today?
Well, in part. I mean, Iraq was a mess. It was I call it a Frankenstein state that was created by the British. Blame it on the English. You know, Maliki lacks the finesse of Saddam Hussein.
Sorry, say that again?
Well,
he lacks the finesse of Hussein.
I'm being ironic, yeah. But Saddam at least managed to keep all the groups together using very brutal force. Even Maliki's people with using electric drills on opponents' knees and acid baths and things has not managed to do this. I said on this program back in 2003, I said what's happening is Iraq will break into three pieces, and that is the objective of Cheney and the neoconservatives around him. They don't want to see democracy in Iraq. They don't want to see a liberated Iraq. They want to see a wrecked Iraq, which is reduced to rubble and then is therefore impotent in the Middle East.
Let us put, well, let me put some more maps up to follow up on this, and then you may have something to say on that. We like maps here. Control room, if you would. The next maps, please, because this will also, I think, amplify on what Eric just had to say. Here's the ethno-religious map of Iraq. The gray Sunni Kurdish part in the north seems, for the moment, holding. The Sunni Kurdish and Sunni Arab part is the pinkish colored part of the map. Go to the more reddish areas, and that's where Sunni Arab populations are. If you want to go to the purple area around Baghdad, that's the Sunni Arab and Shiite Arab areas. And then the blue is the Shiite Arab area. And this, in some respect, well, let's flip over to the next one as well, because this will also tell us about what the ambitions of ISIS are. which are to create one large, for themselves and their particular ideology, new state. Now, Thabit, the first map did in some respects speak to what Eric was just saying, which is this is a country that in many ways is three countries and could be breaking down. You disagree with that?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Iraq is not just composed of three communities, it's composed of a multitude of communities. You know, I agree with what Eric said at the end. Concerning the neocons and their destructive role. I don't believe that the root of this goes back to the British or some sort of a mistake in forming this country. When the English came in, really in World War I, the only area of Iraq that they were genuinely interested in taking was southern Iraq, Basra. It was actually Iraqi elites that lobbied and urged the English to continue onto Baghdad and then even onto Mosul, because they felt that this land between the two rivers has a sense of administrative and economic unity, if not out-and-out political unity, that it cannot become a viable state if it was in pieces. The other very important historic indication is that when the English established the modern government of Iraq, or the modern state of Iraq, there were no calls for the division of Iraq into three groups. No political party in the south emerged that had any kind of popular base that called for a separate southern Iraqi state. There are legitimate demands among the Kurdish population in the north. They did have a genuine sense of a Kurdish nationalism, but even they were co-opted, brought in, and today the largest Kurdish population is in Baghdad, actually, rather than any other place.
Let me get Janice's take on this. Janice, do you think what's happening in Iraq right now threatens to split the country into three separate countries?
It certainly can. I agree with Thabit that this is, Iraq is at this moment on the knife's edge. But one of the really interesting things that works against this, Steve, is a large series of interviews with Iraqi Shia in southern Iraq who have repeatedly said they are Iraqi. They've always distinguished themselves from their Shia brethren in Iran. So there is a sense of Iraqi nationalism which has developed over the last 100 years. Probably the big exception to that is in the north, among the Kurds. The Kurds were able to grab a hold of Kirkuk in this last week. That is a long-standing ambition, and I think this probably is a historic moment for the Kurds in Syria and Iraq. They will come very close to establishing Kurdistan, in fact, if not in name, given the fighting that is going on in both Syria and Iraq. But this is ultimately a failure of leadership. This is a failure of leadership.
Do you believe with what Janice just said?
I see the ISIL as a popular uprising. Not to say everybody's terrorism, hysteria has gripped the states. It's a standard answer now for anything that happens outside that's not under our control is terrorism. But that is to confuse ourselves about the real meaning of the issue. ISIL is a popular movement, however brutal it is and primitive, that wants to undo the 1916 Sykes-Picot Treaty, this vile and sinister secret agreement made by the British and French after they promised independence to the Arabs. They would rise against the Turks, then turned around, stabbed them in the back, and divided up the Middle East between them. And this created Lebanon as an independent state. It led to the creation of Kuwait and some of the Gulf states. It divided Mesopotamia into Iraq, carved it out, it divided up Syria, it took away Palestine from Syria, et cetera, et cetera. So they want to undo this. It's not going to happen because the Western powers won't let this happen. But at the same time, we have to get away from this idea that these are simply terrorists. They do have some political objectives.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. But how much, Eric, of what we're seeing right now is a result of, never mind what you talk about 100 years ago, but let's go back even further, hundreds and hundreds of years. How much of it is that versus the American troops have withdrawn since their invasion of Iraq a decade ago, and this is the aftermath of that?
No, the Americans broke Iraq. It's a Humpty Dumpty that was not going to be put back together. All these problems, or most of these problems, don't result from history, you know, 500-600 years ago. The professor will have a different view, but it results from the American invasion, which destroyed Iraq. I was there. Iraq was the most advanced Arab country in terms of technology, industry, education, social programs, women's liberation. This was the leader of the Arab world, and it was completely smashed to pieces over a decade. Let me say one thing about the Kurds, too. The Kurds are a de facto independent state. The Kurds have been in cahoots with the Israelis since 1970. And the Israelis are stirring the pot in Kurdistan.
To what end?
To setting up a very close alliance with the Kurds. And there's an idea in Israel of eventually building a pipeline one day from Kurdistan through demolished Syria to Haifa, Israel.
Okay, that's another show, Eric. Let me get to Janice, because I heard, Janice, you say you wanted to comment on whether the American withdrawal is the explanation for much of what's going on today.
You know, there's no question that the American invasion and removal of Saddam broke this open. But what did we have before? Yes, we had the most advanced Arab country in terms of science and women, but we also had the most brutal Arab country. Even Assad was not as brutal as Saddam Hussein. And why was he so brutal? Because there was a Sunni minority ruling a Shia majority. That's what creates the brutality. That's what creates the paranoia. For anybody to say that this is the result of the withdrawal of American troops is, frankly, to me, virtually a ludicrous argument, because what that implies is that the United States had to keep troops on the ground for 10, 20, 30 years. That's not possible, that's not reasonable, and in fact it would have exacerbated the problem. What we're seeing now is the failure of leadership by Maliki and the people around him to seize the historical opportunity they were given.
To an extent, I agree with everything that's been said. I would say, if we want to sum it up, really sum up, you can even personalize it. There are three individuals even that are responsible for this. Saddam Hussein, for decades of one of the most fascistic, brutal regimes that smashed civil society and created an atmosphere of fear and violence in the country. George Bush, for the destruction, the physical destruction of this country. Yes. And then the removal of elements of the state, the police, the army, the bureaucracy, without willing to invest what was needed to reconstruct it. And third is al-Maliki, who, despite all the difficulties, still had an incredible opportunity to create a government of national unity, an atmosphere of reconciliation that could go beyond the destruction, beyond the terror, beyond the fascism that the country has experienced. You get extremists precisely because there is a mentality of hopelessness. By the way, you know, just as a further, you know, information on this, I'm in contact with people in Iraq now. Believe it or not, the people, at least, you know, the individuals that I know about in Mosul today, who are very modern, you know, they are quite progressive, they're in no way ideologically committed to the program of ISIS, are delighted that what they say is the sectarian Iraqi army leaving the city and leaving us alone. That, okay, you know, we'll put on a veil and grow our beards and be able to deal with these extremists. But the sectarian army, for them, was far more dangerous.
Let me follow up on one of the names that you mentioned in that list of three. This is from John Cassidy in The New Yorker from earlier this month. The irony is painfully acute. 11 years ago, in response to a terrorist attack by a group of anti-American religious fanatics, the United States invaded an Arab country with hardly any jihadis, or very few of them, to overthrow a secular dictator. Today, with much blood and money having been spent, northern and western Iraq is full of jihadis, and the U.S. government is figuring out how to prevent them from overrunning the rest of the country. You sign on to that, Eric?
I do completely. You know, I was a voice in the wilderness back in 2002, 2003. I said Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction and no links to Al-Qaeda, no links to 9/11. These were lies.
You were right about all three.
And I was. And what is appalling is that the whole American media got on the war bandwagon and started reproducing false propaganda that it was being fed or actively doing it. And today, we see the same so-called experts still on television calling for a reinvasion of Iraq.
Really? I don't hear the same drumbeat for war today and American intervention. Do you hear it?
Not as strong, but they have the same neocon pro-war promoters on, the Bill Cristols. We hear, you know, the Republicans, McCain, just itching to send the Marines back into Iraq. We have a lot of commentators. I watch the talk shows, and they're not giving an accurate view on Iraq.
Well, let me get Janice on that. Do you, first of all, Janice, are you hearing that drumbeat to get American boots back on the ground in Iraq today?
There is a group of people, but it's not the neocons actually, but there's a group of people, paradoxically, what I call the liberal interventionists, who are urging the president to use airstrikes, drones, to share intelligence, to everything short of ground force in order to come to the defense of the Maliki government. And there is a groundswell of those kinds of voices. Now that strikes me as a great irony. Why these liberals, it's not neocons, why these liberals should be urging the United States to come to the defense of a government that missed the opportunity it was given, that is exclusivist in politics, that has failed utterly even now to extend the smallest olive branch to the Sunni community. It's frankly difficult for me to comprehend.
Well, name names. Who are these liberal interventionists who are advocating this?
You know, Max Boot from the Council on Foreign Relations is an example of somebody who's argued very, very strongly for this kind of thing, and an argument that absolutely makes no sense to me whatsoever. And the White House itself is saying that it is reviewing all military options in response to pressures from the John McCains on the right and from others in Congress who do not want to see the huge so-called huge American investment in Iraq go for naught. So it's a funny combination of people. I think the president is resisting. And despite this trope that he's weak, I think he understands that it will accomplish little, that ultimately this problem has to be settled by Iraqis, that there is going to be a violent solution to it in the short run, that's for sure, and that what his predecessor, the way his predecessor bungled what he did in Iraq, caused more harm than good.
Let's, Thabit, follow up on one really fascinating byproduct of the tragedy that is Iraq today, and that is the United States and Iran are communicating because they both have a mutual interest in seeing this thing settle down. What does that portend? Well,
one of the most important elements of instability in Iraq has been the American-Iranian conflict. They have both used allies and proxies in Iraq to try and pressure the other side. So any kind of rapprochement will actually benefit Iraq. Another point I want to say about American intervention or non-intervention. I think I agree that it would be a terrible mistake for the United States to put boots on the ground in Iraq. I think it will only exacerbate the situation. But I think it's also important to mention two things. First of all, the United States bears a massive responsibility to the mess that Iraq is today. Everybody agrees on this, correct? It's wrong also for the United States to simply wash its hands and say, you know, well, we made a mistake, now you guys deal with it. America has to be engaged, but perhaps in a different way. Secondly, again, from contacts with Iraq, I know that people were absolutely petrified several days ago. And many were thinking of perhaps fleeing to the south. When Obama made some strong statements and sent the aircraft carrier into the Gulf, there is more of a feeling in Baghdad that perhaps not all is lost. So I'm not suggesting that because of this, the Americans should go in. I don't believe that people are going to throw flowers on them at all. But America still has a role to play.
I want to two things, actually, Eric, to follow up on here. The American presence in Iraq today is what? I know the George H.W.
5,000 troops, military people, CIA people disguised as contractors and advisors, based in at least 2 air bases.
And the George H.W. Bush aircraft carrier has been moved into the region.
And there are 2 American mechanized combat brigades based in Kuwait, which is just up the road from Baghdad. So America has troops. They have other forces in the Gulf. I want to add also, you know, we hear all about Islamic jihadis on the march, but a lot of these guys are Ba'ath Party. That is not mentioned. Saddam Hussein's Arab Renaissance Ba'ath Party that was allegedly or supposedly dismantled by the idiotic American proconsul in Baghdad, Paul Bremer, remember that? The Ba'ath has returned because one of Saddam's closest henchmen, Izzat Ibrahim al-Duri, has suddenly resurfaced. I've been watching, looking for him for years, and he's now leading the Ba'ath elements. And the Ba'ath were predominant in the Iraqi army. So instead of having wild men jihadis, you're having professional soldiers also involved in the fighting.
Janice, you wanted to add?
Well, that's true. As I said earlier, that there are Ba'ath elements who have rejoined militia elements. But again, this is a ragtag, you know, battle-hardened group that drives around in pickup trucks with guns over their shoulders. And what we're not talking about, frankly, Steve, here, is the Iraqi army melted away in the face of this force.
Yes.
Now, they did. They left their uniforms. We've seen pictures of abandoned uniforms, abandoned guns by the side of the road. Now, why did the army melt away? Many were Shia officers who did not want to fight in Sunni territory, and they voted, frankly, with their feet, and their men fled in the face of what is not a major security threat. That tells you something about the deep divisions that exist in Iraq today, and that's why, I mean, there's no doubt that the U.S. bears responsibility for breaking the fundamental institutions of the state of Iraq. But those institutions, let's not forget, were set up by Saddam Hussein, many of them brutal in their practices. So this was a state that as soon as you took the lid off the kettle was going to explode, and we're seeing it finally now.
But, you know, juxtapose this, I mean, just as another indication of how badly the state has been demolished, juxtapose the fact that the Iraqi army melted away with the fact that it fought for 8 years in the war with Iran, Sunni, Shiite, and Kurd in the same army without ever melting away.
So what does that say about how bad things are now?
Well, I think it's self-evident.
Yeah. Well, we've expanded the army to, the Americans have spent up to $20 billion of borrowed money building up the Iraqi army and expanding it too fast. So it's made up of people who are paid to fight rather than there by feeling. We'll see a similar thing in Kabul. When the Taliban come down from the mountains, the so-called Afghan army and police, also creations of the Americans, are going to run away.
Well, we'll see. Let me get you to follow up, though, on one thing, which is the Colin Powell School of Foreign Policy. Namely, what was that? Was it the Pottery Barn slogan?
Oh,
you break it, you own it?
Well,
right. So does the U.S. own this problem now, given that they most recently broke it 10 years ago?
I think the U.S., thanks to George Bush, owns the wreckage of Afghanistan and the wreckage of Iraq. I think it was the stupidest misadventure in American history, as I kept saying at the time, a lonely voice. And America should be legally responsible for having destroyed Iraq. You know, the American Air Force, before, in the original period, the air war against Iran, destroyed Iraq's complete water purification system. which led to the death of 500,000 Iraqi children. Now, even Madeleine Albright, who was Secretary of State, said, well, it's a price worth paying. I don't think so. I think that people should be held, be brought to book for launching this terrible war which destroyed a country, killed up to 1 million people, and is causing all these problems today.
Janice, I got 30 seconds left. Can you tell us, clearly President Obama does not want to put boots back on the ground there. What are other options?
Well, he does have other options. So one, he can bomb the highways with the pickup trucks on them. So that may stop the advance, although I'm not convinced at all that ISIS is going to move forward into Baghdad, because that is a very large city. They are small numbers, and they would have a great deal of difficulty controlling it. So he could do that. I don't think he would. There's certainly intelligence sharing, accelerated intelligence sharing, which will go on with Maliki. There's drone strikes against individual leaders. Those may well happen. But frankly, I'm expecting a relatively minimal response from Obama. I think he understands that he can do more harm than good by intervening at this moment. And where I do think he'll persist, he is going to hold Maliki to account. If Maliki doesn't move to reach out to form some sort of coalition, Obama will do very little.
Gotcha. Janice, Eric, Thabit, good to have this trio together again. Appreciate your insights on this.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.